And so if you were following along with the verses and the audio, I'm going to go back and I'm going to hopefully present this side by side so that you can see both at the same time. And so I'm going to shrink one and then hopefully bump up the other. There we go. Now we can see both. And so I said here, we're talking about being blameless as a leader in the church. Now, you've read all of the scriptures, I hope. If not, you can go back and we'll talk about those in just a moment. But blameless in the Bible simply means that it's a state of being innocent of wrongdoing, but you're innocent in both the eyes of God, which means that you have salvation, but also in the eyes of men, which means your behavior is so good that everyone trusts you for who you are. So it's a big deal. So a husband of one wife. This is another big one, and you've heard me talk about it if you've listened to the podcast on marriage just a couple of weeks ago. This one's more difficult because some of the translations that you'll read say one woman. Some of the translations misquote and misconstrue it to mean one woman man. Some of them say things that are different, but in order to understand it, first of all, you have to go back to the Greek, and the Greek is the important because here, when you read it in the Greek, and if you want to find this out, you can go to the Blue Letter Bible and look under interlineal. It'll break all of this down for you. It says hais gune, which means one woman. Now, one wife, the wife of your youth. Some people have used it, and you'll find that in the Old Testament in the book of Micah. And so when we look at that, we know that it means one wife, but there's an argument in the church over what Paul meant when he said it. Well, what does it mean, a husband of one wife? Sometimes we have to look at both the scripture and we have to look at history, because sometimes people in history will further define things that are in the scripture. One of the things that I use, and I'll show you this here real quick, is a book called The Ante-Nicene Fathers. Now, this is volume 2, but volume 1 gets into it, and it covers a bunch of different writers who were in the 1st and 2nd century, specifically Irenaeus, Clement of Rome, talking about Polycarp and Justin Martyr and some of the others. Now, here's the point to that. Why do I say all of this? Because every single one of them, without exception, claims that this means the person that you made a covenant relationship with. In other words, your first wife. Because your covenant, even though you may be divorced, your covenant does not break. That's before God. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, because in Matthew chapter 19, specifically verse 6, it says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And if you go down to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10, some people see that one in there. And they say, well, if you have an unbelieving spouse, that you're not bound to that. You're not bound into slavery to that if you look into the actual translation of what it says. But it doesn't say that you can remarry. It just says that you don't have to be bound in a loveless or a godless marriage to someone who doesn't believe. If they choose to go, you're to let them go, but you're not to divorce them, if that makes sense. So that's the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10. But Matthew chapter 19, verses 2 through 6, some of the verses of Micah, I believe it's Micah chapter 6, and some of the others, God hates divorce. And so the only reason he allowed it is because the hard-headedness of the Jews. In fact, in Jesus' day, the law was that if you divorced a woman, you gave her a writ of divorce, and you did all of the legal proceedings right, then you could remarry. But you see, that was man's law, not God's law. And so we're bound to God's law, not to man's law. Even though it may be permissible by the state, it doesn't mean it's permissible from God. So a husband of one wife. One last thing that I'll read to you here from the Apostolic Constitutions, and you'll find this, you can look it up. Apostolic Constitutions is the name of the book. Book 6, section 3 says this: but he that divides again into two, which has become one, talking about marriage, is the enemy of the creation of God and the adversary of his providence. For you ought to know this, that once marrying according to the law is righteous, as being according to the will of God, but second marriages after the promise are wicked, not on account of the marriage itself, but because of the falsehood. So Apostolic Constitutions, Book 6, Section 3, and you can also look in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, they all agree without exception that marriage is to be between one man and one woman until death do you part, until God does a separation through death, but not otherwise. So, in fact, one last thing, divorce was intended to be punitive. What that means is if someone committed adultery, they had sinned against you, the marriage, and God, then you could divorce them. But the idea was you did not take them back. However, if they repented, if they were given over to Satan and they repented and came back, then you could be remarried to them, and that was acceptable. But that was one of the only clauses for divorce and remarriage. So let's look at number 3, because we don't want to drag this out. Number 3, temperate. What does temperate mean? It's a good one, right? Let's see if we can get to the point here. There we go. This thing put it in more than one time. So temperate. What does temperate mean? In the Bible, the term temperate refers to a state of self-control. In other words, you're in control of yourself. You are kind of mild-mannered. You're laid back. It's often associated with the virtues of self-discipline, because that's really what temperate means. You have self-discipline. You have restraint. You're not going to blow up every minute. So temperate, it's a good one to have, right? I think so. What about sober-minded? Sober-minded refers to being all there. You have mental clarity. You know what you're saying. You have self-control. You have a spiritual vigilance. You know when you're under spiritual attack. You are discerning in the spirit. And really the importance here is the emphasize being free from intoxicating influences. You're sober-minded. You're not drunk. You're not high on something. And that could be both alcohol or illicit drugs that causes a change in our mindset. So keep that in mind. Sober-minded. Number 5, of good behavior. That really goes without saying, doesn't it? I'm going to behave myself. I'm going to be good. I'm going to give myself a good reputation by the way I act. That's really the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, against which there is no law. Yeah, most of you have heard that one before. Of good behavior. Number 6, hospitable. Well, what does that mean? Hospitable. Hospitable means the Greek word translated like this is philoxenia, which literally means you love strangers. Anyone who comes in, you are hospitable to them. You're willing to bring them in, to feed them, to care for them, to give them a place to stay. It really boils down to Eastern mindsets, where if someone came to your tent and they held onto the tent rope and asked for sanctuary, even though they were a stranger, you were to bring them in and care for them. So hospitable. Number 7. Number 7 is able to teach. If you're going to call an elder, a leader, a pastor in your church, they need to be able to teach, because how else are they going to become the people who disciples others? Matthew chapter 28 says, go and make disciples. And then the last part of that says, teaching them to obey whatsoever I have commanded you, meaning Jesus speaking to the apostles at the time. So you want somebody that's able to break down in context using exegesis to help anybody to understand the passage. And the passage is able, they should be able to teach anyone from child to adult. You're to disciple. So you want someone who is able to teach. It's a very big deal. Not given to wine. You don't want somebody carrying around a cup of wine or hard liquor or beer everywhere they go. Well, why? Well, 1, it gives a bad impression. But 2, it implies there may be an addiction there. And if they're given to wine, in other words, they're drunken, then they're not qualified to be your pastor. And that's just what the scripture says. So moving on. Not violent. Well, duh. We should understand that one, right? You don't want somebody that's just going to be mean and nasty. Not violent. Very important. Not greedy for money. Is everything they talk about money, money, money? Is everything they're reaching for money, money, money? How can I get wealthy? How can I do this? How can I do that? You don't need a pastor that's focused on that. Because why? Because he's going to store up his treasures where they should be stored, which is in heaven. Important. So not greedy for money. Number 11, gentle. Some of the kindest, loving, most awesome pastors I've ever met were some of the gentlest men I've ever known too. So gentle. Not always argumentative, number 12. You don't want somebody who's quarrelsome, who always wants to argue or fight. Not a good look. It's not good for your church. It's certainly not good for anyone else. So not covetous. What does that mean? Well, they don't always want what other people have. They're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. You don't have a new car every other week or a new house or new whatever's going on. They're not covetous. They don't want what others have. They're focused on Christ. You want somebody who is exhibiting Christ, who is giving that mirror look. Somebody who manages his house well. What does that mean? It could be his money, but it's also his children. His wife stands by him and respects him and yields to him when should be. And at other times, he lifts her up. He loves her because he manages his house well. It's going to be a balanced approach. Manages his house well. Important. Number 15, and this one is overlooked in so many different places. Do you have a pastor whose children are not believers? Yeah, that's a big one. If his children are not believers, he's not managed his house well because he hasn't brought them to Christ. He hasn't taught them what they need to know. His children are believers. That's a big deal. You also want to make sure that they're not unruly or breaking their parents' rules all the time. Are they always in juvie? Are they always in trouble? Are they always doing bad things? My kids are not always doing bad things or in trouble. Do they get in trouble? Yeah. But that's because I manage my household. So his children are believers, number 15. Number 16, not a new or a young believer. Well, why? You bring in a new or a young believer as a pastor in a church and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have that maturity, that upbringing that he needs. He's going to fall just like Satan did. He's going to get puffed up in his pride and he's going to fall. And not only is it going to affect him, you've set him up for disaster, but it's also going to hurt the church. Doesn't need to be new or a young believer. And that one's pretty self-explanatory. He needs to have a good reputation with others. When people are outside the church, see him and talk to him, they should genuinely like him and appreciate who he is. They know that they can trust him. Why? Because he has a good reputation. He's somebody who does the right thing. Number 18, he is not self-willed. If you have a pastor that no matter what counsel he's received, or maybe he doesn't receive counsel at all, maybe he doesn't listen to anybody, he's so self-willed that he just does what he wants to when he wants to, he's not going to succeed, and neither are you as a church. You need a pastor who is not self-willed. Number 19, not quick-tempered. He's not quick to start a fight. You don't want him to throw fists. You want him to be calm, gentle, able to have logic whenever he talks about things. Number 20, you need him to hold tight to Scripture. How's he going to hold tight to Scripture? He has to know it. He has to know Scripture. You need someone who is mature enough that they know the Word. Why? Because they need to be able to teach with authority. They need to be able to know it so well that they can tell the fakes, the false teachers, when they come. You want him to be able to discern between the spirits. So when somebody comes in who's saying the wrong thing, he's not here, not in this church. And you can help escort them to the door. You need a pastor who holds tight to Scripture. He needs to be able to defend the faith and expose the lies that are taught by others. And I don't know if you've paid attention lately, but I have seen just so many different advertisements by people, one, who are heretics openly, who profess things that are not in the Word, who are false teachers and cults too. And boy, they are on the rise. They're pushing hard. I don't know how many different cult messages I've seen lately. And it's crazy. But why? Because Satan knows his time is short. So let's go backwards on these so that we can get back to this. And if you want to read these and you didn't read it in the first video, it's 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. So those are important ones to go through. This is where I pulled all of this from. And so number 20 is he needs to hold tight to Scripture. He needs to know it, or he can't tell the fake ones. Can't be quick-tempered. You don't want him throwing fists. Not self-willed. You want him to be able to listen to counsel. Why? Because as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. You need him to be able to listen. Number 17, has a good reputation with others. You don't want somebody who nobody outside likes him. Can't be a new or a young believer. Number 16, why? Because he'll get puffed up with pride. He'll fall and he'll break something. He'll be just like Satan, who wanted to be God. He didn't want to be like God. He wanted to be God. A young believer will fall into that trap. So his children are believers. The assumption here is that your pastor, 1, is a male, 2, that he's married, and 3, that he has listened to the command out of Genesis and that he has children. Now, I'm not saying if they can't have children that he's terrible. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But if he has children, his children are believers. Why? Because he set an example, and he's doing what Deuteronomy chapter 6 tells us. He's talking to his children about the word when he gets up in the morning, when he sits down at lunchtime, when he walks along the road, and when he lies down at night. All of those are important. His children are believers. Number 14, manages his household well. His wife and his children respect him. They listen, they do things. That doesn't mean they're not going to be kids. Kids will be kids. They're going to do things. It happens. But in general, they're standing there with their dad. He manages his household well. Number 13, not covetous. He doesn't want what everybody else has. He doesn't need what everybody else has. He is content with what God has given him. Now, every one of us is going to have a want or something that we really want over time. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about somebody who is continually coveting what everybody else has. We don't want that. Not argumentative, or quarrelsome. You don't want somebody who wants to argue all the time, not always argumentative. Here's another one that we said earlier. That's a big one. You want him to be gentle. Why? You get a pastor who is not gentle and doesn't know humility and doesn't know how to address people who are living in sin the wrong way. He'll run them off instead of drawing them in and teaching them what they need to do. And then when they're hurting, who are they going to turn to? They're not going to turn to your pastor. They're going to go away. You don't want that. I'm not saying that you okay sin and you allow it to exist in your midst amongst believers. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is he needs to be gentle so that people will listen and so they'll hear him. Number 10, not greedy for money. That's self-explanatory. You and I both know that. Number 9, not violent. He's not a fighter, not someone who kicks up dust every time you turn around. Number 8, not given to wine, not a drunkard. That should be pretty exempt. But keep in mind, that also goes for marijuana, cocaine, crack, any of those things. You don't want somebody who's addicted to substances, whether it's alcohol or other, because their addictions will control them and they won't be given over their spiritual efforts to the church the way they should. Number 7, able to teach. You should be able to break down the word, to exegete the scriptures absolutely in a way that helps everyone to understand from the youngest to the oldest. Number 6, hospitable, doesn't know a stranger, invites them in, loves on them, does what he should in his home. Number 5, of good behavior. What's good behavior? You instinctively know what that is. Number 4, sober-minded. Someone who thinks clearly, who understands spiritual things, who understands when they're under spiritual attack and knows when to pray and ask God to help him. Number 3, temperate. Temperate, we talked about that earlier. What is temperate? Somebody who's kind of chill, somebody who's mild-mannered, someone who knows what they're doing and can control their temper. It's the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Temperate. Number 2, we beat this one up enough, but a husband of one wife. Why? Because it's important that he follows God's law, not just the laws of the land. Number 1, first but not least, blameless. No one can point at him and say, you did this or you did that, or I can prove that you're an evil person. He needs to have a good reputation both inside and outside the church. If you have a pastor that doesn't meet those requirements, think about what's going on. Let's go through these verses here real quick again, just to make sure that we've covered them. I know that we did earlier, but the qualifications are here. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. It's a good thing to want to be a leader. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. We've read all of these already. Sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. They should do what he says. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? And that's the point. If you can't manage your own household, how are you going to be able to manage the church that you've been called to lead? You can't. He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into condemnation of the devil. Satan's had over 5,000 years to figure out humankind and their weaknesses, and he takes advantage of it every chance he gets. You don't want to take a young man and put him in a place where he'll be puffed up and fall like the devil did. He'll get hurt, and he'll hurt the church. Number 7, verse 7, moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Titus chapter 1 and verse 5 says, this is why I left you in Crete. Paul is talking to Titus, who he's left behind, and he's giving him instructions. He says, this is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained in order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and see, I didn't make that up, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination, for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. We've already covered all of those, and blameless and all of the other things there. You must not be arrogant, prideful, or quick-tempered, or a drunkard, or violent, or greedy, but hospitable. Again, that hospitality. A lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and able to rebuke those who contradict it. How do you know a counterfeit? You know the real thing so well that when the counterfeit comes across, there's no question. Your pastor, your elder, your leader needs to be able to detect the counterfeit so that he can hold you to the true word and instruct you in sound doctrine. With that, I've already done this twice tonight because I missed the audio up on the other one. So please forgive me. If you didn't watch the first one, you didn't miss anything. The second one has everything in it. So I love you guys. Again, keep our folks in prayer. We have friends that I know need prayer. My daughter-in-law needs prayer. A lot of things going on in our world today that people need prayer for. Love on them. Be there for them. Be hospitable. Do what it needs to be done. We certainly pray from here. And I want to be there, but I can't be in two places. I love you guys. I wish you the best in everything. Genuinely, I do. May God give you his peace, and may he make his face to